Two supersonic interceptors dropped from the clouds, locking their radars onto the battered, slow-moving A-10 Warthog. Over the radio, the mercenary pilots laughed, calling it target practice. They didn't know the Warthog was a trap. They didn't know they were hunting the Widowmaker, and they were already dead. The air over the Kestrel corridor was thick with the acrid stench of burning diesel and pulverized stone. Down in the mud, pinned behind the rusted-out husks of destroyed convoy trucks, Sergeant Mitchell was screaming into his radio. "Hog 111, we are completely overrun. Heavy armor advancing from the tree line. Danger close. I repeat, danger close." 5,000 feet above the carnage, Captain Victoria Kinsley remained terrifyingly calm. Her breathing was slow, rhythmic, an anchor in the storm of combat. Inside the cramped cockpit of her A-10C Thunderbolt II, the displays glowed with chaotic data, but her eyes were fixed outside the canopy. "Copy that, Mitchell," Victoria replied, her voice smooth, devoid of the panic that infected the ground troops. "Keep your heads down. I'm rolling in." Victoria banked the heavily armored jet, feeling the familiar sluggish groan of the airframe. The A-10 Warthog wasn't sleek, it wasn't fast. It was, for all intents and purposes, a flying bathtub of titanium built around a massive 30 mm GA-AU-8/Avon rotary cannon. It was ugly, brutal, and entirely merciless. She lined up the crosshairs on her heads-up display. Down below, 3 enemy armored personnel carriers were tearing through the tree line, their turrets swiving toward Mitchell's squad. Victoria squeezed the trigger. The Warthog shuddered violently as the cannon spun to life. Bird! The iconic, terrifying sound of the gun tore through the valley like the roar of a mechanical dragon. A stream of depleted uranium shells the size of milk bottles vaporized the lead APC in a blinding flash of kinetic energy. She walked the pedals, dragging the stream of fire across the remaining 2 vehicles. They erupted into dual pillars of black smoke and twisted metal. "Good hits, Hog 11. You just bought us a pulse," Mitchell gasped over the comms. "Resetting for another pass," Victoria said, pulling back on the stick. But as she gained altitude, the sharp, sterile voice of the OWACS controller cut through the tactical frequency. "Hog 111. Overlord, break off your KAS mission immediately. We have hostile fast movers inbound, bearing 090, altitude 20,000, speed Mach 1.2. They are hunting you." Victoria checked her radar warning receiver. 2 harsh spikes blinked aggressively on the digital scope. Fast movers, fighter jets. The airspace was supposed to be clear. The Allied 15 escorts had returned to base 20 minutes ago to refuel, leaving Victoria as the only asset in the sky. She was entirely alone, flying an aircraft that topped out at barely 400 knots, being hunted by interceptors capable of breaking the sound barrier twice over. "Overlord, this is Hog 111. Time to intercept." 90 seconds. Hog 111. They are closing fast. Advise you dive to the deck and exfil south. High above her, Commander Elias Stanton and Lieutenant Pierce Croft adjusted their oxygen masks. They were flying state-of-the-art twin-engine strike fighters, painted in the matte black of their private mercenary contracting firm. They had been paid a staggering sum by the rogue state holding the corridor to clear the sky. Stanton stared at his radar screen, a cruel smile touching the corner of his lips. "I have tally on the target, Croft. It's a Warthog, single ship." "A Warthog?" Croft laughed, the sound crackling over their encrypted channel. "Are you kidding me? It's a flying brick. The pilot's practically a sitting duck." "Don't play with your food, Croft," Stanton replied, though he shared his wingman's amusement. "Let's put it out of its misery." Stanton reached forward and switched his radio to the open international emergency frequency. Guard. He wanted the Allied pilot to hear him. He wanted the fear to set in before the kill. "Attention, Allied A-10. Stanton's voice echoed through Victoria's headset, smooth and dripping with arrogance. "You are completely outmatched and out of airspace. You look like a fat little pig wandering away from the farm. Eject now, and we'll let you parachute to the ground. Stay in the cockpit, and you burn with the jet." Inside her cockpit, Victoria didn't flinch. She reached up and turned the volume down on the guard frequency just a fraction. She didn't bother replying. Trash talk was for amateurs who needed to convince themselves they were dangerous. Instead, She shoved the throttles forward and rolled the Warthog completely inverted, pulling the nose straight down toward the earth. She wasn't going to run south into the open desert, where their radar-guided missiles would swat her out of the sky with ease. She was diving directly into the Devil's Spine, a brutal, claustrophobic network of jagged limestone canyons that cut through the valley floor. "She's diving," Croft called out, trying to hide in the clutter. "Request permission to engage, Commander." "Granted," Stanton said. "Fox 3, send it." Croft locked his targeting pod onto the descending heat signature of the A-10 and pressed the weapon's release button. A sleek radar-guided air-to-air missile dropped from his wing, its solid rocket motor igniting with a brilliant white flash as it accelerated to Mark V, screaming straight toward Victoria Kinsley. The piercing wail of the missile lock alarm flooded Victoria's headset. The red warning lights bathed her face in a hellish crimson glow. Missile inbound, 6 seconds to impact. Victoria kept her eyes locked on the rapidly approaching canyon floor. The Devil's Spine was a nightmare of tight turns, sheer cliff faces, and towering stone pillars. It was no place for a fighter jet, but the A-10 wasn't a fighter jet. It was a brawler. 4 seconds. She waited until the canyon walls rose up on either side of her canopy. 2 seconds. "Now," Victoria whispered. She slammed the throttle, dumped a massive spread of chaff and flares, and pulled the stick hard into her lap in a violent high G-bank around a massive stone outcropping. The Warthog screamed in protest, the massive straight wings biting into the dense low-altitude air, executing a turn so impossibly tight that it defied the laws of aerodynamics applied to modern swept-wing fighters. The missile, moving far too fast to adjust its trajectory in the confined space, lost its radar lock in the chaff cloud. It overshot the turn, slamming into the limestone cliff with a deafening, earth-shaking explosion that showered Victoria's canopy with gravel and dust. High above, Croft cursed as his radar screen showed a splash of static, followed by the Warthog's blip reappearing alive and well, deep inside the canyon trench. "Missile trashed," Croft growled. "She dumped the lock in the terrain. Then we go down and dig her out," Stanton commanded. "Guns and short-range heat seekers. Don't let her get comfortable." The 2 black interceptors inverted and plunged into the canyon. As they dropped below the rim, the reality of the environment hit them. At 600 knots, the sheer rock walls were passing by in a terrifying blur. To fly a supersonic jet in a canyon is to thread a needle while riding a bullet. Victoria, however, was in her element. She throttled back, dropping her speed to 300 knots. At this speed, the interceptors behind her would struggle to stay airborne if they tried to match her maneuvers. They were designed for high-altitude speed, not low-altitude knife fights. She began to weave left-right, dropping into narrow ravines, her wingtips mere feet from the jagged stone walls. Stanton was struggling to keep a visual on her. Every time he tried to pull his nose for a gun solution, the A-10 would snap into a turn that his fast jet simply couldn't physically replicate without stalling and plummeting into the rocks. "She's flying it on the edge of a stall," Stanton muttered to himself, watching the masterclass in low-speed aviation unfolding ahead of him. "She's bouncing off the canyon walls like a pinball." "Commander, I'm pushing the throttle," Croft barked, frustration bleeding into his voice. "I'm going to cut across the next bend and hit her with the cannon." Stanton narrowed his eyes. He zoomed his optical targeting pod in on the Warthog, trying to gauge her loadout. As the high-resolution camera focused on the battered gray fuselage, the sunlight caught a faded emblem painted just beneath the canopy. It was a black hourglass. Stanton felt a sudden icy drop in his stomach. His eyes flicked to the tail flash. The numbers matched the rumors that had circulated through the mercenary underground for the last 3 years. "Coughed, hold your fire, break off," Stanton yelled over the radio. His previous arrogance entirely evaporated. "I have the angle, Commander. I'm taking the shot." "I said break off, damn it," Stanton screamed. "Look at her tail number. Look at the nose art. Do you know who that is?" Croft hesitated, glancing at his own optical feed. "It's just an A-10 pilot, Elias." "That is Captain Kinsley," Stanton said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "They call her the Widowmaker." The legend of the Widowmaker was a ghost story whispered in the officers' clubs and mercenary barracks across the globe. 3 years prior, during a botched extraction op in a hostile mountain range, Kinsley's wingman had been shot down, alone, heavily damaged, and missing half of her right vertical stabilizer. She had refused to leave the airspace. 2 enemy fighters had moved in to finish her off. Neither of them returned to base. She had used the A-10's ridiculous survivability and terrifying low-speed turning radius to drag the fast movers into a fatal trap. She had turned a purely defensive aircraft into an aerial predator, using the mountains as her shield and the 30mm cannon as her sword. "She's not running, Croft," Stanton said, his knuckles turning white on the flight stick. "She's pulling us in. Pull up now." Croft snapped. "It's an urban legend. She's a mud mover. Watch me turn her into scrap." Croft ignored his commander's orders. He hit the afterburners, the twin engines roaring as he accelerated toward the next canyon bend, intending to ambush the A-10 as it rounded the corner. But Victoria wasn't running. She had spent the last 2 minutes perfectly calculating their speed, their turning radius, and their impatience. She knew the exact moment the wingman would snap. As she entered a wide, circular basin within the canyon, Victoria didn't continue through to the exit. Instead, she threw the throttles back to idle, deployed her air brakes, and executed a maneuver that should have ripped the wings off a lesser aircraft. It was a high-G split S, transitioning immediately into a pedal turn. The A-10 Warthog practically stopped in midair, violently swinging its nose 180 degrees around. Croft rounded the corner at 500 knots, his finger resting on the trigger, expecting to see the tail of the fleeing Warthog. Instead, he found himself staring directly down the barrel of the 7-barrel rotary cannon. Kinsley wasn't fleeing. She was waiting for him. "Oh God," Croft managed to whisper over the radio. Inside her cockpit, Victoria's eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of mercy. The crosshairs of her HUD rested squarely on the center of Croft's canopy. "Target practice," Victoria whispered to herself. She squeezed the trigger. The GA-AU-8/A Avenger did not fire bullets. It fired a solid wall of kinetic devastation at a cyclic rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. The rotary cannon unleashed a dense stream of 30mm depleted uranium armor-piercing incendiary shells. From Croft's perspective, rounding the canyon bend at 500 knots, there was no time to evade, no time to pull the ejection handle, no time to even scream. He was staring into a strobe light of hellfire. The Warthog stream of heavy munitions caught the mercenary's sleek black interceptor dead center on the nose redome and walked backward directly through the cockpit and into the twin-jet turbines. Modern fighter jets are miracles of engineering built from lightweight composites and aluminum alloys to minimize drag and maximize speed. They are not built to withstand the armor-shredding weaponry designed to crack Soviet main battle tanks wide open. Croft's aircraft didn't just explode. It simply disintegrated. The kinetic energy of the shells shattered the airframe into thousands of flaming pieces, turning the $60 million warplane into a cloud of expanding shrapnel and vaporized jet fuel. The concussive shockwave of the detonation rattled Victoria's teeth as she casually rolled her heavily armored A-10 through the expanding fireball. The titanium bathtub surrounding her cockpit easily deflecting the debris of her enemy. High above, banking hard to avoid the canyon walls, Commander Elias Stanton watched the digital blip representing his wingman vanish from the tactical data link. Croft, check in." Stanton barked into his oxygen mask. Only static answered him. He looked down into the gorge. A rising column of thick, oily black smoke marked the grave of his second-in-command. From the smoke, the gray silhouette of the A-10 Warthog emerged, banking smoothly, entirely unscathed. A cold spike of pure, unadulterated terror drove itself into Stanton's chest. The rumors were true. The Widowmaker wasn't just a pilot, she was a predator, and Stanton had just locked himself in a cage with her. "Vanguard Control, this is Vanguard 1, Stanton stammered over his encrypted radio, his previous arrogance replaced by the frantic edge of survival. "Vanguard 2 is down. I repeat, Croft is KIA. Target is hostile, highly capable, and utilizing terrain. Requesting immediate vector for egress. Negative, Vanguard 1. The cold voice of his mercenary controller replied, "Contract dictates the airspace must be sanitized. You have superior speed, superior avionics, and radar-guided munitions. Take altitude, acquire lock, and destroy the target. Do not RTB without confirmed kill." Stanton cursed violently. His employers didn't understand. They were looking at spreadsheets and spec sheets. On paper, his advanced strike fighter outclassed the aging Warthog in every conceivable metric. But on paper, battles aren't fought inside the claustrophobic limestone trenches of the Devil's Spine. "You want her dead? Fine," Stanton growled, shoving his throttles past the detent and into full afterburner. The twin engines roared, kicking out massive cones of blue flame as Stanton pulled his nose up in a punishing 9G climb, intending to rocket out of the canyon and attack from high altitude, where the A-10 couldn't follow. But Victoria Kinsley was already 3 steps ahead of him. She knew the fast mover's only advantage was energy and verticality. As Stanton pulled out of the canyon, bleeding his horizontal speed for a vertical climb, he momentarily presented a massive glowing heat signature against the cool blue sky. Victoria didn't bother trying to pull the A-10's heavy nose up for a gunshot. Instead, she thumbed the weapon selector switch on her flight stick. A high-pitched, angry growl filled her headset, the seeker head of an AIM-9 Sidewinder heat-seeking missile locking onto Stanton's afterburners. "Fox 2, she stated calmly, squeezing the release button. The Sidewinder leapt off the Warthog's underwing pylon, a white-hot spear of vengeance tracking the climbing interceptor. Stanton's threat receiver screamed, "Missile launch 6 o'clock low." "Damn it," he roared, instantly snapping his jet into a violent barrel roll while simultaneously mashing his countermeasure release. Dozens of magnesium flares burst from his tail, creating a blinding cluster of heat signatures in the sky. The Sidewinder, confused by the sudden overwhelming heat of the flares, tracked slightly left, detonating harmlessly 100 yards away from Stanton's wing. The shockwave rattled his airframe, but he was alive. He had made it out of the canyon. He was in the open sky. He breathed a heavy sigh of relief, leveling his jet at 15,000 feet. He had the high ground. The Warthog was trapped down in the mud. Now it was his turn. Stanton rolled his jet inverted, looking down through the top of his canopy to locate the A-10. He expected to see her hugging the canyon floor, trying to flee. Instead, his eyes widened in disbelief. Victoria hadn't stayed in the canyon, anticipating that Stanton would dump flares and dodge the missile. She had used the distraction to pull the Warthog into a steep, agonizingly slow climb, riding the thermal updrafts off the canyon walls. She wasn't running, she was coming up to meet him. "You want to play in the deep water, Kinsley? Let's play," Stanton sneered, his confidence returning. He had altitude, he had speed. He pulled his nose down, diving directly toward the ascending Warthog in a classic boom and zoom attack profile. He selected his 20 rotary cannon, placing the digital pipper over the slow-moving gray cross of the A-10. Victoria watched the black fighter plunging toward her. Her airspeed was dangerously low, hovering around 200 knots. At this altitude, in a climb, the Warthog handled like a flying garbage truck. "Warning, stall approaching." The mechanized voice of bitching Betty echoed in her helmet. I know," Victoria muttered, her hands flying across the instruments. Stanton was closing the distance at Mark 1. The geometry of the merge was happening in fractions of a second. Victoria waited until he was perfectly committed to his dive angle. She knew he wouldn't pull away. His ego wouldn't let him. He wanted the gun killed to avenge his wingman. At a range of 1 mile, Stanton opened fire. A stream of 20 explosive rounds stitched through the air. Simultaneously, Victoria kicked the left rudder pedal hard and slammed the stick forward, deliberately inducing a snap roll that violently threw the A-10 out of its flight path. It was a desperate maneuver, but it wasn't quite enough. Stanton's rounds tore through the right side of the Warthog. Victoria felt the entire aircraft shudder as if it had been struck by a freight train. The sound of tearing metal and shattering glass was deafening. The cockpit lit up like a Christmas tree. Master caution alarms blared. The right engine temperature gauge spiked instantly into the red before failing completely. A massive chunk of her right wing had been blown away, exposing shredded hydraulic lines that spewed highly flammable fluid into the slipstream. The Warthog violently rolled to the right, beginning a terrifying death spiral back toward the earth. Stanton pulled out of his dive, pulling heavy G's as he leveled off. He looked over his shoulder and watched the crippled A-10 plummeting, trailing a massive plume of black smoke and fire. "Vanguard control. Target is neutralized," Stanton said, a cruel, breathless laugh escaping his lips. "The Widowmaker is going down." Inside the spinning cockpit, chaos reigned. The G-forces pinned Victoria against her seat, her vision narrowing to a dark tunnel. But the panic never came, only cold, methodical training, right engine fire. She reached forward and yanked the T-handle for the right engine fire extinguisher, physically shutting off the fuel flow and flooding the nacelle with halon gas. The flames trailing behind her sputtered and died, leaving only thick smoke. Hydraulic failure. Flight controls unresponsive. Most modern jets are fly-by-wire. If you lose hydraulics and computers, you are flying a brick. The A-10 was different. It was a relic of the Cold War, built with the expectation of taking massive battle damage from Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Victoria grabbed the manual reversion switch and threw it with all her strength. Instantly, the heavy mechanical linkages connecting her flight stick directly to the control surfaces engaged. Flying the A-10 in manual reversion was like trying to steer a semi-truck through a snowstorm with no power steering. Using only sheer upper body strength, gritting her teeth, her muscles burning with the exertion, Victoria fought the death spiral. She pushed the stick hard left and stomped on the rudder. The airframe groaned, the damaged wing fighting for lift, 1,000 feet above the canyon floor, 800, 500. With an agonizing shudder, the wings leveled out. Victoria was flying on one engine, half a wing, and pure mechanical cables. The jet was crabbing sideways, bleeding airspeed, but it was flying. Above her, Stanton was casually orbiting, waiting for the inevitable impact to confirm his kill. He glanced down at his targeting pod, expecting to see a crater. Instead, his blood ran cold, limping just above the tree line, battered, smoking, and utterly defiant. The gray silhouette of the Warthog was still airborne. "Impossible," Stanton whispered. "Half her wing is gone. The engine is dead. How is that thing still flying?" Rage blinded him. It defied logic. It defied physics. He inverted his jet and dove back down, determined to put a missile right up the Warthog's surviving tailpipe. "I'm going to turn you to ash," Stanton screamed. Down in the mud, Sergeant Mitchell and his squad were staring up at the sky. They had heard the explosion, seen the A-10 falling in flames. Their hearts had sunk, but then they heard the distinctive high-pitched whine of a single TF-34 turboan engine struggling to survive. "Look," Mitchell yelled, pointing over the treeing. The crippled Warthog was flying directly toward them, low and slow. And right behind it, dropping from the clouds like a falcon, was the black interceptor. Victoria checked her radar warning receiver. Spike, enemy lock. She had no flares left. She had no hydraulic power to pull evasive maneuvers. She was flying in a straight line at barely 150 knots. She was a dead woman, unless she did exactly what they expected a dead woman to do. She keyed her radio, speaking not to Overlord, but to the ground team. "Mitchell, get your men flat in the dirt. Cover your ears." Stanton's targeting computer beeped, indicating a perfect lock. He pressed the missile release button. Nothing happened. He pressed it again. Weapons malfunction. His aggressive maneuvers and the high G dive had caused a feed jam in his weapons pylon. He cursed, instantly switching to his cannon. He only needed 3 seconds of sustained fire to rip the cockpit apart. He brought his nose down, the Warthog growing massive in his gun sight. 2 seconds, 1 second. Victoria didn't evade. She didn't turn. Using every ounce of strength in her arms, she pulled the heavy mechanical flight stick directly back into her lap, yanking the nose of the A-10 violently upward into the sky, directly into Stanton's flight path. Because of her incredibly slow speed, the A-10 didn't climb. Instead, it executed a Cobra maneuver born of sheer brute force mechanical failure. The nose pitched up 90 degrees, turning the entire flat underbelly of the Warthog into a massive air brake. Her forward airspeed instantly dropped to 0. Stanton, diving at 600 knots, suddenly found the Warthog virtually stopped in midair right in front of him. He didn't have time to process the physics of the maneuver. His instinct screamed at him to pull up to avoid a mid-air collision. He yanked back on his stick, his jet pulling 9 Gs as it violently pitched up, exposing its fragile, unarmored belly to the nose of the stalling A-10. For one breathless fraction of a second, the two aircraft hung suspended in the sky, nose to belly. Through his canopy, Stanton locked eyes with Victoria Kinsley. Her mask was down, her visor was up. She was staring right at him, her eyes burning with the cold, absolute certainty of the Grim Reaper. Her finger squeezed the trigger. At point-blank range, the GIU-8 Avenger roared. The depleted uranium shells didn't just penetrate Stanton's jet, they severed it entirely in half. The 30 rounds sliced through the aluminum fuselage just behind the cockpit, instantly detaching the twin engines and tail section from the rest of the aircraft. Stanton's world became a blinding flash of warning lights and screaming alarms before the automatic ejection sequence initiated. Explosive bolts blew his canopy away, and the rocket motor beneath his seat fired, blasting him out of the cockpit just milliseconds before the front half of his multi-million-dollar interceptor tumbled out of the sky and smashed into the earth. Stanton dangled from his parachute, swinging wildly in the air, watching in absolute shock as the wreckage of his superior machine burned in the mud. He looked up. The Warthog, smoking, violently shuddering, dropped its nose back down. Victoria stabilized the crippled aircraft, the single engine screaming in protest as she slowly gained a meager altitude. She didn't look back. She had done her job. Over the radio, a stunned silence hung over the tactical net. Finally, Sergeant Mitchell's voice crackled through the static, thick with awe. Hog 111. This is Mitchell. Hostile fast movers are down. Ground forces are retreating. You cleared the board, Captain. Victoria wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, leaning back against the ejection seat. The stick was heavy. The warning alarms were still screaming, and she had a 100-mile flight back to base in a flying scrap heap. She keyed the mic, her voice as calm and deadpan as it had been when the fight began. Copy that, Mitchell. Buy me a coffee when you get back. Hog 11 RTB. As the battered, indestructible A-10 Warthog limped towards the horizon, dragging a trail of black smoke across the sky, Elias Stanton hung in his parachute, entirely defeated. He had learned the hard way what the rest of the world already knew. You do not hunt the Widowmaker. Did this true tale of aerial mastery and the indestructible Warthog get your heart racing? The Widowmaker proved that technology is nothing without the tactical genius of the pilot behind the stick. If you want more adrenaline-fueled combat stories and real-life military legends brought to life, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Drop a comment below on what legendary aircraft we should cover next. See you in the skies.